Do you want to play drums without getting a noise complaint? Well, you've come to the right place. Today I'm going to be comparing 4 products that will lower the volume of your specifically snare drum. I'm going to be focusing on how to get the best feel and sound of a snare drum in a more quiet, practice-friendly environment. Is it even possible? Let's find out. I've been looking for different practice solutions for drums for quite a while. I started by converting an acoustic kit to an electric kit, and I've been slowly upgrading and changing things out to find the ultimate practice / low volume jamming solution for playing drums. One thing I noticed with a lot of these options is they felt fine on the toms or the kick, but the snare drum was always lacking. And to me, I feel like most people would agree that the snare is the heart of the drum kit. And if that just doesn't feel right, you're not going to want to play it, and it just kind of kills the enjoyment. It's also the drum that you're hitting the most. The snare really needs to have that realistic feel. I'm leaving affordability out of this equation because all of these options are under $100. The most expensive is $70, and most of them are hovering around there. The mesh heads are obviously the cheapest. So if that's your main goal, is just to find the cheapest, that is the best option. I think you could probably get a 14-inch mesh head for around $40, if not less. About half the price, so that's significant, but we're still talking about between $40 and $70. So not a huge jump to make your snare that you're going to be using the most really feel and sound the best that it can. So the 4 products I'm going to be comparing are, 1, your typical mesh head that you see everywhere. Mine is a Tama brand, but they're almost identical to the Remo Silent Strokes, which are probably the most popular option out there. And then the next one, which is probably the second most popular, is the RTOM Black Holes. These are also mesh, but they are a lot thicker, more sturdy mesh with a pad in the middle. And these also allow you to just place it over a drum head without removing the original drum head, which all of these do provide except the mesh head. So all the other ones you can just place on top of your snare, which is nice if you're going to be transitioning from low volume to full volume frequently. The third option is a less common option, the Aquarian Superpad. These seem to be very hard to find. I've been looking for one for like years, literally like 2 or 3 years, and they just never seem to come in stock. So I don't know if they're discontinued, but I was able to pick one up on Reverb. I used one for like $20, so they might just not make them anymore, unfortunately. But the last one they still make, and this one is even less common. I've actually never seen a comparison of this one versus the other options. I've seen a lot of comparisons between the RTOMs and the traditional mesh heads, and even some Aquarian Superpad stuff out there. But this last one, the Sabian Quiet tone, I think is a fantastic option. I think the main reason this option is overlooked is because they only make one for the snare. So a lot of people are looking for options to replace all of their drum heads with something, or place something over all the drum heads and come in a kit, right? So this one is only for the snare, so you're going to have to find another way to quiet your other drums. There's only a 10-inch and a 14-inch option. Today I'll be using the 14-inch option with a 14-inch snare. The snare drum I will be using is a alder snare that is part of a D-drum reflex kit. It's a great snare drum. I just have the stock head on it, but it sounds great, and it's actually pretty loud. I will also be recording all of the sounds in the same position with an SM57. I also have a stereo room mic that I'll blend in a little bit to give you an idea of the room sound, but everything's going to stay consistent so you can really have a good comparison. So I've created 3 categories I'm going to be comparing all of these 4 options with. The first one is volume, so how much does it reduce the volume? How quiet is it? The second one is feel. So how realistic does it feel compared to a real snare drum? And then the final one is sound. So how does it sound compared to a real snare drum, or just in general, how do they sound comparable to each other? So let's talk about volume first. Now, they're all going to reduce the volume quite a bit, significantly quieter than playing an actual snare drum, to the point where you definitely don't need to wear earplugs. It's not like damaging levels of hearing where a drum kit definitely is. It's definitely louder than a electric kit, but I was looking for a way to kind of bridge the gap, because you got to make some sacrifices when you're lowering the volume. Electric drum kits, I think, are the one extreme where they're silent and they sound good because you're triggering sounds that were recorded in a beautiful studio, but the feel is just not there. And I'd rather sacrifice some volume and sound to get the best feel. So feel is most important to me, but I'm going to be comparing all of these three factors to give you the best idea of what would work for you. They're all going to reduce the volume pretty significantly, but if I had to pick, no question, the quietest is the traditional mesh head that is very popular, like the Remo Silent Stroke. These are the quietest by a decent amount, I would say 3 or 4 dBs, but I'm going to give the traditional mesh head a 10 out of 10 because that is the quietest one, so you can't really beat it. The second quietest is actually going to be the Aquarian Superpad. These are pretty close. I would give it a 8. The one main thing to consider is there's a lot of low mids still in there, whereas the mesh heads kind of remove a lot of the low end. So although looking at the dB meter, you might see that it's about the same. In the room, it would carry more. Like if you're worried about people being in the next room or upstairs or something, it would carry a little bit more than the mesh heads, just because it retains more of that lower sound from the snare drum. And then after that, we're going to go with the quiet tone, and I'm going to give that a 7. The comparison through the dB meter is a little misleading here because it looks like it's the loudest by far, but I think the way the mics were set up, although it's all consistent, you're getting a lot more stick sound that's right next to the mic. The quiet tones also do remove some of that low end, so that's going to help stop the sound from carrying as much, but it is going to be perceived a little bit louder when you're right next to it. Me personally, I feel like the Aquarian Superpads are louder. When I'm playing them, it seems louder to me than on the quiet tone, Sabian Quiet tones. But looking at the dB meter, you can't argue that it definitely is louder. So that's why I'm giving that a 7. One other thing to note is if you actually do want it to be a little bit louder, I tested it out and flipped to the snare side and had the quiet tone sitting on the snare side to get more of that snare sound, which we'll talk more about when we were talking about the sound section. But that added even more volume. So if you actually did want to have more volume and get more of that snare sound, you could do that, especially if you're matching with another pad set, because that's something else you got to keep in mind is if you have mesh heads on all of the toms and then you're using one of these louder things on the snare, it's going to be unbalanced. That's just an option, so you have a little bit of flexibility there for adjusting the volume. If you want to add more volume to match something like our next option, which is the RTOM black holes, these are definitely the loudest. So if you had black holes on the toms, you might want that extra volume from the quiet tone by flipping the snare. The RTOM black holes were definitely the loudest, even though, again, it doesn't show it very well in the dB meter, but the frequencies that the pad is activating are very loud frequencies that are going to carry. It's still, of course, significantly quieter than a full-on snare drum, but I'm going to give the RTOM black holes a 5 out of 10. They are definitely the loudest. And one other thing to consider is dynamics. Now, the dynamics are the difference between the quietest sound and the loudest sound, where a lot of the other ones have more control over the dynamics. The RTOMs are actually the most dynamic, which might be a positive thing because having dynamics makes it feel more realistic. But the other ones kind of, you hit the wall or limit pretty quickly, where no matter how hard you hit, it's not going to get any louder. Where the RTOMs, if you get too excited and really wail on it, it's going to be noticeably louder than the more average hits that you're making. So that's something to consider. Like if you're a really hard hitter, the RTOMs are going to be noticeably louder than the other options. But of course, the harder you hit it, the louder it's going to be. So they all have dynamics. It's just the RTOM stood out to me a little bit more, where I felt like, oh, if I hit it normally, I have one volume, but if I really hit one hit extra hard, like it's noticeably louder than the rest. So let's move on to the next category, and arguably the most important one. This is what has motivated me to even explore other options, because I felt like the feel was lacking on some of the options. So for feel, number one, hands down, goes to the Sabian Quiet tone. I'm giving that a 10 out of 10 for feel. It is the closest thing to a real snare drum that I have experienced in terms of practice pads. It uses a real snare drum mylar head, and it's very, very sturdy and has very little give, like a tightened snare drum would. It's a very hard surface, and the rebound feels very natural and realistic because of that. And I would say it's 95% what a real snare drum is. It feels, if you had your eyes closed, you could tell the difference. If you couldn't hear, there would be very, very minor differences, and it would be hard to tell. Where these other options, like, it would be night and day. You would know, oh, this is not a real snare drum. The second place goes to the Aquarian Superpad, and that I'm going to give a 8. This is because it has some rubbery feel to it. It's still not nearly as bouncy as a mesh head, but you can tell that your sticks kind of dig in a little bit more than what a more harder surface would be, like a real snare drum. But it still feels very good, and I would be happy with using a Superpad on my kit. Third place goes to the RTOM Black Holes. These are noticeably better than the mesh heads, but still in another league compared to the first and second place options. So I'm going to give them a 5. You can clearly tell that you're not playing on a snare drum, but it still is a lot thicker of a mesh. It feels way more realistic than a thinner mesh head. One of the main perks that the RTOMs have that none of the others do, I guess technically the mesh head does have this too, but you can adjust the tension on it, whereas the Sabian Quiet tone and the Aquarian Superpad are just what they are. You can't adjust anything on them. The RTOM allows you to adjust the tension, so you do have that flexibility to get it closer to what you're used to. I just tend to crank it as high as it goes, and I still don't feel like it feels that realistic to me. But if you're used to maybe playing a looser snare drum, then that might feel more realistic to you. I feel like it feels great on the toms, but the snare drum, still there's too much give to it. And the more you tighten it, it also affects how it is working with the actual snare drum underneath, and sometimes it can make it sound really bad if it's too tight. So that's something else. Like maybe you've got it to your perfect feel, but then when it's on your snare drum, you get a lot of buzz or something like that. So definitely wins for flexibility, but I'm giving it a 5 and putting it in third place for overall feel. And last place is definitely the mesh heads, in this case the Tama mesh heads, but again, silent strokes are identical here. These to me just do not feel realistic whatsoever, and I would give them a 2. They're just so far away from the other options out there that there's really no comparison in terms of feel, in my opinion. There's just way too much bounce, and it has that trampoline effect that a lot of people refer to, where you don't feel like you're hitting against a surface. And it actually is nice because it's less harsh when you hit it, and there's less vibrations from the drumsticks. It's probably better on your joints, but it just, in terms of feel, it's not. And that brings us to our last category, and that is sound. Obviously, sound is very important in music, but you're going to have to make some sacrifices when you're trying to lower the volume. We've seen this with a lot of other things. I've done comparisons with guitar amps and how to lower the volume of tube amps while still getting the saturation of the tubes. When you lower the volume, it's still, you're losing something. Like, it's just, that's the nature of it, is you can't have everything, unfortunately. So in terms of sound, I'm actually going to tie for first place the Quiet Tone, the Sabian Quiet Tones, and the Aquarian Superpads. And I'm both going to give them a 9. So neither of them are 10, but they're both 9 in their different ways. So the Quiet Tone is 9 because it's the most realistic sound in terms of like really giving you more of a punch in the center and giving you that different sound towards the rim of the snare, and which is great for practicing because it motivates you to hit that center of the snare just like how you would it on a real snare drum. So I really like that aspect of the sound, of getting a different sound from the edge to the center. And it just also sounds a lot more open. You're getting more ring from the snare, which none of the others really give you that ring of the snare drum from hitting it. Whereas the Aquarian Superpads are very muffled. It sounds like you've really muffled the snare drum, which could be what you're going for, but that's really your only option. Whereas you could muffle the snare drum on the Quiet Tone if you wanted to, and then also have the open sound. Whereas the Aquarian is always going to be muffled, which is sometimes what people want. People use the gels on the snare, or even a full towel over the snare. It's its own sound, and it is a cool sound. So I think Aquarian wins in that cool sound category, where it just has this very interesting sound. The Quiet Tone also has more of the stick sound because it is a harder surface, so you're getting a lot of the stick sound, and then the snare sound is kind of afterwards. So when you hit it, you hear the initial stick sound, and then it activates the snares like right after. So there's kind of like that decay that you would hear on a snare drum, but there is a lot of that stick sound. Whereas the Superpads, that rubbery feel actually absorbs a lot of the stick sound. So you're getting less of the actual stick sound and more of the snare sound, which is great because when you're playing low volume, you don't realize how much of the stick sound actually sticks out, because when you're playing a full volume kit, the drums are so loud that you're not even noticing the sound of the sticks actually hitting anything. It's more of just the sound of the actual drum. But when you're lowering the volume, that stick noise is a lot more apparent. So the Superpads really take care of that by absorbing a lot of the stick hit and just giving you the snare sound, which is really nice. And then we have a big decline, I think, in sound. And believe it or not, in third place, I would actually give it to the cheapest option and the most traditional, popular option is the mesh head. And I would give that a 6 because it's noticeably worse than the other two options, but it still can be a good sound. You do have to adjust the snares a little bit more and kind of mess with it to get the sound you want, which does give you more flexibility, but it's kind of a pain to find the perfect spot where you're not getting too much buzz. But if you tighten your snares too much, then it's going to kind of buzz a lot and be unpleasant. So you kind of have to find that sweet spot with how tight the snares are when you're using mesh heads. I think the sound is acceptable for what it is. I think it's more acceptable on the toms and kick than it is on the snare, but it's still definitely an acceptable sound. Whereas the RTOMs, unfortunately, I don't find to be acceptable. I would put them in last place and give them a 4, if not a 3 out of 10 for sound. And that's unfortunate because when they're on the toms, they sound incredible. They sound perfect. I have zero complaints. But on the snare, no matter what I do, I cannot get them to sound good. Like, it's just, the buzz is really bad, and it just accentuates bad frequencies from the snare drum, and it's not pleasing whatsoever. I've looked online for different clips, and I can't really seem to find anyone that can make it sound good. So I don't think it's just me. I think that, unfortunately, on the snare, it just does not sound good. One thing to consider if you liked everything else about your RTOM black holes is to just replace the snare. And that's what this video is for. So that sums up the 3 categories. Now you can add up each category and see who won, but really it doesn't matter. It's just what category is more important to you, because the mesh heads came in first for the first category in volume, but then did bad on the other 2. And it's like, well, what's more important? You might not be able to have the luxury of having to have different volumes, and all you need is the quietest and cheapest solution. Well, then there you go. But for me, the best option for me personally is the quiet tone. And that's probably not a surprise, because I told you the most important part was the feel, and the quiet tone won that category. And since it tied in the sound category for first, well, there you go. Maybe it didn't do as good on the volume, but the volume is kind of negligible in my opinion. Like, if you're able to play on a mesh head, I'm sure that environment you would also be able to use a Sabian Quiet tone, but I could be wrong. Sabian Quiet tone number 1. Aquarian Superpad is a close second. I think it's a great option. The RTOM and the traditional mesh heads, those are going to be significantly worse just for the snare. I just don't think they're good options for the snare. But hopefully I've at least given you the information you need to decide what option is best for you. And if I have, or you found this video interesting, it would help me out if you subscribed. I do a lot of gear reviews and other sound experiments and live recordings. So if any of that music production stuff is interesting to you, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.